Hello and welcome to a brief-ish history of Mount Everest, part 1 of 2. In order to make these videos an appropriate length, I've had to cut down or skim over certain areas of Everest's history. Now with that out of the way, let's take a look at the history of the highest point on Earth. Mount Everest, the world's highest peak, was first observed by Westerners in 1847 and was named Peak B. In 1848, the British Surveyor-General of India, Andrew Waugh, sent James Nicholson to survey the mountain and ascertain its height. Nicholson completed his measurements, but was forced to leave due to malaria before he could complete the calculations needed to get the exact altitude. The mountain was renamed Peak 15, and over the next several years, mathematicians were able to determine the exact height of Peak 15 by working with Nicholson's calculations. In 1856, Waugh officially announced that Peak 15 was the highest on Earth. The survey showed that Peak 15, which was measured in feet, stood at 29,000 feet high, but Waugh reported it as 29,002 feet high so people wouldn't think he had rounded the number. Now all that was left was to give the mountain a proper name. Waugh decided to call it Mount Everest, after the previous Surveyor-General, George Everest. Everest wasn't too keen on the idea, though. He thought that people would have trouble pronouncing the name, and he seems to have been right. Everest now stands at approximately 8,850 meters high, and is growing every year due to the movement of tectonic plates. In the early 1920s, the Royal Geographical Society and the Alpine Club in England jointly set up the Everest Committee. This organization planned a reconnaissance expedition to the mountain to pave the way for future summit attempts. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Howard Bury was chosen to lead the team. Harold Rayburn, Alexander Kellas, and Guy Bullock were among the others chosen for the trip, including George Mallory, Sandy Wollaston, Alexander Heron, Henry Morshead, and Edward Wheeler. This is where we find one of the most famous men in Everest's history. George Mallory was one of the most well-known mountaineers in the world at that time. He was born in 1886 in Mobberley, England, and married Ruth Turner in 1914 before joining the army and serving as an artillery officer during the First World War. It was Mallory who, when asked, "Why climb Everest?" famously answered, "Because it's there." The team arrived in India in May 1921, but faced a lot of problems during the hike to the mountain. Kellas died of a heart attack on the journey, and Rayburn was badly kicked by a horse, forcing him to leave the team temporarily while he recovered. Despite these setbacks, they were able to reach Everest and scope out the mountain, collecting valuable information for future climbs. The border between Tibet and Nepal runs right up and over Everest at the peak, splitting the mountain in half, with Tibet to the north and Nepal to the south. The reconnaissance team were only legally allowed to inspect the Tibetan half of Everest since Nepal had closed its borders, but they trespassed into Nepal and examined the south end of the mountain as well. This is what the northern Tibetan side of Everest looks like. The summit is here, and the long northeast ridge slopes down to the left. The north ridge slopes down from the northeast ridge and then back up again to Changtse. The lowest point on this ridge, which you can't see because Changtse is in the way, is called the North Col. The expedition spent the summer mapping and scouting out possible climbing routes before leaving in September. 1922 saw an almost entirely new group of men set out for Everest, and this time they intended to try for the summit. General Charles Bruiser Bruce was to lead the expedition. The other members included Edward Strutt, who was Bruce's number 2, George Mallory, George Finch, Edward Teddy Norton, Henry Morshead, Howard Somerville, Arthur Wakefield, Tom Longstaff, Geoffrey Bruce, General Bruce's cousin, John Morris, Colin Crawford, and John Noel, who was the team's photographer. Interestingly, it was Finch who invented the down-filled jacket, which was much warmer than anything that the others had brought on the journey. There was a debate among the climbers over whether or not to bring oxygen to the mountain. The sets used at that time weighed 15 kilograms, and it was thought that the extra energy that oxygen provided would be outweighed by the weight of the apparatus. Mallory especially was against the idea, calling it unsporting. Finally, the decision was made to bring the oxygen sets, but make their use optional. The team reached Everest in May, and the first attempt on the summit was to be by Mallory, Somerville, Norton, and Morshead without oxygen. The plan was to establish a series of camps at higher and higher altitudes on the mountain, with Camp 4 being established on the North Col. The climbing party established Camp 5 about 600 meters above the col, and on the morning of May 21st, the men set out from Camp 5 for the summit. They were only able to reach an altitude of 8,169 meters, though, before they turned around from exhaustion. They decided not to stay at Camp 5, but returned to Camp 4 on the North Col, where they hoped to get a better sleep at the lower altitude. On the way down, Moorehead fell, and since they were roped together, he dragged Norton and Somerville with him. Mallory only managed to save them by ramming his ice axe into the snow and wrapping the rope around it, stopping their fall. They moved a lot slower after that, and made it to the col in one piece. The next morning they descended down to Camp 3, as Finch, who was wearing his down-filled jacket, and Jeffrey Bruce went up to try their luck with oxygen. They set off from an altitude of 7,800 meters on May 24th, accompanied by a Sherpa named Tejbir Burra, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. The oxygen worked marvels, and they were able to reach a height of 8,320 meters before Jeffrey Bruce's oxygen suddenly cut out. Luckily, Finch was able to repair it, but he decided that it would be too dangerous to press on. On June 5th, another attempt was made by Mallory, Somerville, and Crawford, but before they reached the North Col, an avalanche swept them away and killed 7 Sherpas who were with them, ending the expedition right then and there. They were the first to die on the mountain during a summit attempt, and it drove home the dangers of what they were attempting. Another expedition wouldn't be made until 1924, and General Bruce was again chosen to lead this attempt. The 1924 team saw some familiar faces from 1922, such as George Mallory, Edward Norton, Howard Somerville, Jeffrey Bruce, and John Noel, who was again to be the team's cameraman. Other members of the team included Noel Odell, John MacDonald, Edward Shebiar, Bentley Beetham, and Andrew "Sandy" Irvine. Now, Irvine's name is spelled I-R-V-I-N-E, and I've heard it pronounced as both Irvine and Irvin. I'm going to go with Irvine because that's the way it looks like it should be pronounced to my eyes. Irvine is another famous figure from Everest's history. He was a student at Oxford and hadn't done much climbing, but he was a great mechanic and had built up mountains of stamina from being on the college rowing team. Mallory wasn't sure about coming on this trip, having just secured a teaching job at Cambridge, but did, in the end, decide to go. He was getting old, or at least old for a mountaineer, and was afraid that this would be his last chance at the summit. But before the team reached Everest, General Bruce got sick from malaria and had to abandon the expedition, leaving Norton to lead the team. They arrived at Everest in late April, but were hampered by bad weather in the middle of May. The weather cleared at the end of the month, though, and Norton and Somerville were able to make an attempt at the summit. Camp 6 was established 600 meters short of the top, and would be the last stop-off for climbers before they tried for the peak. Norton and Somerville left Camp 6 at 6:40 a.m. on June 4th, but suffered bad luck immediately. Norton forgot his sunglasses and suffered from snow glare, while Somerville developed a bad sore throat. There were 2 obstacles that they would have to overcome, known as the first step and the second step. These were 2 30-meter-high walls of rock on the northeast ridge. Although they were on the most direct route to the top, they would be difficult, and no one had ever climbed them before, so Norton and Somerville decided to go around them, making the climb longer but safer. Somerville stopped at around midday and couldn't carry on, so Norton went on alone and reached a record height of 8,650 meters before turning around. On the way down, the 2 made a brief stop at Camp 6 before carrying on to the North Col, but that night, Norton went blind from the snow glare that he had been exposed to all day. He didn't want to carry on with the expedition, but Mallory convinced him to let him have one more shot at the summit. This time, he would use oxygen, and he wanted to bring Irvine with him. Norton didn't approve of this, saying that he should take Odell, who was much more experienced. Mallory kept insisting on Irvine, though, and since Norton wasn't in a state to argue, he agreed. Irvine wasn't all that bad of a choice, since he had been taking an interest in the oxygen equipment and learning how it worked, and, more importantly, how to fix it. The pair left Camp 6 on the morning of June 8th, and thus began the most mysterious and hotly debated climb of Everest's history. Odell was carrying supplies up to Camp 6 at around 1 o'clock, when a cloud of mist broke and allowed him to look up at their progress. They were in the area of the first or second steps and making good time, although they were lower than they should have been at that time of the day. They had evidently decided that they would take the most direct route to the summit along the northeast ridge and take their chances on the steps, rather than to follow Norton and Somerville's less direct route. The weather took a turn for the worse around 2 o'clock, and that was the last that their team saw of them. Odell began to worry because of the bad weather, and to fear that if Mallory and Irvine turned back, they wouldn't be able to find the tent. He went out a little ways from Camp 6 to shout and yodel, but no one came. When the storm cleared around 4 o'clock, he reluctantly went back to the North Col. Mallory had told Odell not to stay at Camp 6 because there was only enough room for 2 men in the tent. He continued to watch Camp 6 from the North Col, though, and in the morning took a party of Sherpas up to Camp 5, but stopped there because of the cold. On June 10th, he went up to Camp 6 alone, but found no one there. Mallory and Irvine were never heard from again, and their summit attempt remains one of the most debated in the mountain's history. Questions like, did they make it to the top? Could they have made it at all? And, did they die on the way up or on the way down, and if it was on the way down, were they returning in defeat or in triumph? Remain unanswered to this day. The death of Mallory and Irvine ended the 1924 expedition on a very low note. Mallory was one of the greatest climbers in the world at that time, and had a wife and 3 children back in Britain, and Irvine was a 22-year-old university student with his whole life ahead of him. Over the next 100 years, clues would appear, which, far from solving the mystery, add yet more questions. Various climbers in the second half of the century would claim to have spotted one or the other of their bodies, but these reports couldn't be confirmed. In 1933, during another failed attempt at the peak by the British, climbers discovered Irvine's ice axe on the northeast ridge. 1999 brought with it the biggest leap forward, with the discovery of Mallory's body, which was identified by a tag on his collar. Well, that's all I have for you today, guys, but there will be another video about this coming out soon. In the meantime, I recommend you check out the Wikipedia article on George Mallory and watch The Wildest Dream, The Conquest of Everest, which is a documentary about Mallory's fateful climb. Thanks for watching, and feel free to subscribe and leave a comment with your thoughts about this video. See ya later!